Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is John Aubuchon, and I'm Senior Correspondent for Newsnight Maryland with Maryland Public Television and Vice President of the National Press Club. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. The video archive of today's luncheon is provided by Connect Live and is available through the National Press Club website at press.org. National Press Club luncheons also are carried live by many sites on the World Wide Web. Press Club members may also access transcripts of our luncheons at our website. Non-members may purchase transcripts, audio, and videotapes by calling 1-888-343-1940. Before introducing our head table, I'd like to remind our members of future speakers. On Monday, June 4th, Gerald R. Ford, former President of the United States, will present the Gerald R. Ford Prizes for Distinguished Journalism at our next NPC luncheon. Tuesday, June 5th, 2001, Ralph Nader, consumer advocate, will discuss, as he puts it, conceit and consent, the two-party duopoly. And on Friday, June 8th, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, Archbishop of Washington, will be our guest at the Press Club. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards provided at your table and pass them up to me. I'll ask as many as time permits. I'd like now to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly as their names are called. Please hold your applause until all head table guests are introduced. From your right, my left, Frank Wilner of Traffic World, John Horsley, Executive Director of the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, a guest of our speaker, Larry Arnold of the Associated Press, Brent Coles, the Mayor of Boise, Idaho, who is President of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, also a guest of our speaker, Keppler Speakers, who is with the Yomiuri Shimbun, and passing to my direct right is Gil Klein of Media General, who is a past president of the National Press Club. Passing over our speaker for a moment, Gene Grabowski, who is Communications Vice President of the Grocery Manufacturers of America and the Press Club member who arranged today's luncheon. Thank you, Gene. April Taylor of the Detroit News, Sylvia de Leon, member of the Amtrak Board of Directors, again a guest of our speaker, Tim Dobbin of Reuters, Thomas Donlan of Barron's, and Matt Small of Fox News. Thank you. George Warrington is having a good year so far. But in Amtrak's 30th anniversary year, he is also dangling from a very short rope, struggling to build a solid financial footing under Amtrak by 2003, the year Congress has set for pulling away the chair of federal operating subsidies. The official Warrington Amtrak view: it'll be tight, but they'll make it, provided Congress takes a very different view on another pot of money. Mr. Warrington wants $30 billion over the next 2 decades for capital costs for new and modern rolling stock, infrastructure, and other improvements. Considering what we spend on highways and airports, he has said, that's not too much. And Amtrak has significant infrastructure problems. Remember the film The Money Pit? Well, substitute Amtrak's track system for that house remodeling hell, and you get the picture. A federal reform council studying Amtrak's future suggests as one option putting those tracks in the hands of another newly created government corporation and letting Amtrak just run the trains, an option Mr. Warrington opposes. George Warrington has been a railroad man for more than a quarter century, coming up through the ranks of commuter rails in New Jersey and Delaware before joining Amtrak in 1994. His first Amtrak job was running the Northeast Corridor operations, where he turned the Metroliner from a money loser into a system that not only covers its own costs, but also throws off profits to cover part of Amtrak's overhead. When Amtrak's board dismissed its last president, Warrington got to test drive the office for a year, and 17 months ago, the board removed the acting prefix from his job title. But by then, he already had a full head of steam. Amtrak was committed to spending $800 million or so for Acela Express, a new high-speed, upscale train, 21 trains, in fact, to revolutionize service in the Northeast Corridor. Well, Acela was a year and a half late leaving the station, piling up more losses for Amtrak and giving more fuel to its critics, but it is rolling now and attracting record ridership revenues and customer service accolades on its maiden Washington, New York, Boston routes. Mr. Warrington says Acela eventually will generate $200 million a year in net profits. He wants to replicate the success on this corridor to other potentially high-traffic routes, Los Angeles to San Francisco. But those riders won't stay on the trains, he believes, without customer service that's vastly improved over what we've been used to, and why already he's gotten Amtrak employees to smile and say hello to passengers. He started a frequent traveler program to match the mileage credits that the airlines hand out. And that old shoebox the attendant drops your money in when you buy a sandwich on a train, gone, he promises, to be replaced by state-of-the-art point-of-sale systems. To find out what other changes this Syracuse cum laude grad will be putting on track, I give you George Warrington.
Thanks so much for, I think, that kind and generous introduction. Before I begin my remarks, there's a couple of people, my special guests, who I would like to recognize. First, Sylvia DeLeon, who's our Amtrak board member here today and who's chairman of our Corporate Affairs Committee. And I can always count on Sylvia to keep me focused. And she's a terrific sounding board for me, and she's very helpful around setting this corporation's long-term policy. I also want to make a special recognition and thank you to my very good friend, Brent Coles, the mayor of Boise, Idaho, who has been leading the fight and developing consensus and momentum in the U.S. Conference of Mayors about this important question, investing in rail in America. And John Horsley, I want to thank you for being here as well. John represents all of the transportation policy interests in all of the states across this country, and he's been a terrific supporter. It really is a great pleasure for me to be here today, and the opportunity really comes at a very special moment in Amtrak's history, the very month when this organization turns 30 years old. Now, as one who only recently reached that milestone myself, I also know that this is an age when many things change and, more importantly, responsibility grows. And so the discussion I'd like to have with you all here today really is about change, the steps that Amtrak is taking to strengthen intercity passenger rail to improve travel choices, but it's also, as or more important, about responsibility that federal policymakers must take to define Amtrak's mission and provide the federal investment to support it. 30 years may be a little too early to write the Amtrak memoirs. But if we were to write the honest, tell-it-all book about this company, it really would be a tale of two Amtraks. One Amtrak is working very hard, very, very hard, to transform itself into a much more customer-focused, market-driven organization, partnering with states and the private sector and mayors like Mayor Coles, and improving mobility for people and commerce in this nation. In the end, working very hard to try to make a difference. The other Amtrak tale, frankly, doesn't read so well. It's the story of mission conflict, a 30-year history that suggests to me that running an intercity passenger rail service with a national public service mandate and running a profit are not compatible. Today, I want to address both tales. And while I am a bit over 30, just a bit, I'm still young enough to be an optimist. The progress that Amtrak has made in recent years and the critical need for more capacity and more transportation choices in America today, particularly in the context of an increasingly competitive global environment, really are compelling storylines. Let's talk about the first tale first, the one about how Amtrak is working smarter and we're working harder and we're working better. In 1997, we reached an agreement with the federal government. In return for about $2 billion in federal capital, we committed to work more like a commercial business and eliminate federal operating assistance by 2003. We are working very hard to keep our promise. And one of the things I want to do here today is thank the 25,000 very hard-working Amtrak men and women who make this possible day in and day out, oftentimes under very, very difficult circumstances. First, we've made significant improvements on our own service, like introducing Acela Express, the only customer service satisfaction guarantee offered by a national carrier in the travel business. We've been helped also by external factors, clearly market chaos, as well as rising gas prices. Driven by many of these factors, we've set ridership and revenue records for 4 years, and this year we'll set a new record. On the expense side, fixated on cutting costs. Cost management is our top priority in our business plan, which calls for saving an average of about $270 million a year over the next 4 years. We're also generating significant additional revenues from commercial sources, and we have leveraged our federal capital to produce an additional dollar from non-federal sources for every dollar that's been invested by Washington. As a result of these efforts, we've slashed our federal operating support from $318 million in fiscal '99 to about $59 million this year. And we've done this even as we faced unexpected delays in the delivery of our Acela high-speed train sets. Because of all these positive changes, I fully expect, and I know, and I commit that we will meet our commitment to operational self-sufficiency in 2003. That is my responsibility. That is our responsibility, and we are very, very serious about it. While we've been working hard to meet this federal mandate, we've also been working with governors and mayors like Mayor Coles and business leaders, CEOs, Chamber of Commerce presidents all across this country day in and day out. They are searching for hard answers to America's transportation crisis. And no wonder. Everywhere, it seems, people are talking about transportation frustration. But the toll goes well beyond mere inconvenience and frustration, like I experienced last week in Portland, Maine, where I waited for a plane for about 4.5 hours. It's staggering. It's a staggering $100 billion annual chokehold on this nation's economy. Today we waste $100 billion a year trying to move people and trying to move commerce through transportation bottlenecks and a system that does not work well in an integrated way. My purpose here today, and I want to be clear about this, my purpose here today is not in any way to knock the other modes of transportation. In fact, many are our partners, like Continental Airlines and United Airlines and Midwest Express and my good friend Craig Lynch at Greyhound. In fact, many are our partners, and we've had our own share at Amtrak of on-time performance problems due to railroad congestion. What I am saying is that we as a nation are paying, all of us, are paying an enormous price for our declining mobility. State and local officials and business leaders like Mayor Coles understand this problem and these costs better than anybody. They're on the front lines in the war on congestion. Since 1996, 21 states across this nation have invested more than $850 million in intercity rail projects working with Amtrak. In just one region of the country where we've made these investments, ridership on our Cascade service in the Pacific Northwest has grown nearly 500%. And there are many more examples of this kind of success where we invest wisely across this nation. And today, 38 states are working with Amtrak on the development of high-speed rail services to give travelers a real choice, greater comfort, convenience, and faster trip times. Imagine New York to Washington or Washington to New York in 2 hours and 5 minutes, or Los Angeles to San Diego in just over 2 hours. The facts are today we have 150-mile-an-hour train sets. I see Don Phillips sitting here up front. Don has written often. We have 150-mile-an-hour train sets, and we have an infrastructure on the Northeast Corridor. For example, in Baltimore, where our track speeds are restricted to 25 miles an hour because those tunnels were built around the Civil War. That's just a fact of life, and that's the irony, particularly within the context of America's transportation problem today. But to fulfill the potential of these partnerships, capital investment is essential. Working together with the states, we've developed a 20-year capital investment plan. The plan provides a blueprint for strengthening the network and developing higher speed services in federally designated corridors. It calls for increasing the annual federal investment in intercity rail from 1% to about 2.5% of the federal transportation budget, about 2.5% of overall federal transportation spending, to roughly $1.5 billion a year. A substantial portion of this financing would come from the High-Speed Rail Investment Act, which is sponsored in the Senate by our very good friends, Senator Joe Biden and Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson. The bill would authorize Amtrak to issue $12 billion in bonds over the next 10 years to invest as partners with states and freight railroads in high-speed projects across this country. Importantly, most importantly, it would do so without diverting a single dollar from our highway system or our aviation system. It's a fight that we don't want, and it's a fight that we don't need. Once again, we're working with state and private sector partners. We're working with the nation's governors through the National Governors Association, the U.S. Conference of Mayors through Mayor Coles, and more than 40 other organizations to enact this legislation, which also happens to have the support of 30 newspapers and editorial boards across this nation. There is a simple reason for this renewed interest in intercity rail service. The basic infrastructure, the most underutilized asset in the American transportation marketplace, is already in place. For a relatively modest investment, and everything is relative, but for a relatively modest investment, we can gain substantial capacity and mobility benefits for Americans. Simply put, you get significant bang for your buck when you wisely, and I emphasize wisely, invest in rail. And I'm not suggesting that we should invest exclusively in rail. In fact, given the population growth and travel demand forecasts that we are all staring at, which are in many ways frightening, we have to invest smartly in all travel options and do a better job of working together to make them all work together so customers, whether they be shippers or manufacturers or passengers, witness and experience a seamless transportation system. What we need to do is make the concept of intermodalism in this nation more than a cliche. In fact, investing in rail can benefit all of the modes. Think of our national transportation system as a three-legged stool. For the stool to stand, all three legs, the highway system, the aviation system, and the rail system, have to be strong, and they all have to be sturdy. Today, as we all know, too much of the weight of travel demand in this nation rests on the highway and the aviation legs, when a healthy and more efficient balance could be struck with the development of rail choices and alternatives in many markets in America. That's our first tale. The story of Amtrak working very hard and working smarter and working better. Certainly, I assure you that our work is not nearly done. What we are delivering better results and better service to our guests and improving every facet of our business by being better partners with states, cities, and the business community all across America. Let's now turn the page to the other Amtrak story. It's the tale that really doesn't read so well. In 1971, Amtrak was created with a mission in law that reads in part, Amtrak shall completely develop the potential of modern rail transportation to meet the needs of the United States. I would suggest that that's a public service mission. At that time, then Secretary of Transportation John Volpe heralded Amtrak's future, which Frank Wilner has written about in his book, The Amtrak Story, that Amtrak would be profitable in 3 years. Actually, we'd break even in 3 years and be profitable in the 4th year, I believe. When that goal hadn't been realized, some 26 years later, Congress enacted legislation requiring Amtrak to become operationally self-sufficient by 2003. That sounds to me like a commercial mission. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're a public service provider, you go where the community need is. If you're a business, you go where the money is. But if you're Amtrak, considering that conflicting mission, which way do you go? Well, believe it or not, over the last couple of years, we are managing to go in both directions simultaneously. We will make operating self-sufficiency while serving a national network. But this achievement has two very, very important consequences. One, it leaves Amtrak with losses in a classic business commercial sense, after accounting for such items as unfunded capital depreciation. Two, it requires internal cross-subsidies from commercial revenues and profitable train services. The bottom line is you cannot meet a mandate to run a national network and perform in a true profitable commercial sense when you look at the P&L at the end of the day. For 30 years, Amtrak has been expected to perform like a business and at the same time serve community needs like a nonprofit organization. We cannot do this, and more importantly, we shouldn't let this unrealistic expectation erode confidence in this rail system, which I would argue is more important today than at any time in recent history. Just as we need a clear mission, we also need adequate capital investment to support that mission. Since 1971, when Amtrak was created, $11 billion in federal money has been invested in intercity passenger rail infrastructure, nationwide, 22,000-mile system. At the same time, we've invested 70 times that number, or $750 billion, in our highway and our aviation system. And that's the right thing to do. In the past year, the federal government invested more than $33 billion in our highway system, more than $12 billion in our aviation system. We support those investments. Yet it invested about $500 million last year in intercity passenger rail, less than 1% of all federal transportation spending. This nation still has no dedicated source of federal capital for investment in intercity passenger rail, unlike every other transportation mode. So our ability to invest in our current network and in the high-speed rail services that so many communities want and deserve really is, as usual, uncertain. Clearly, I have to tell you, it's no way to run a railroad, or frankly, for that matter, any other part of this nation's transportation system, certainly in a dependable way. What do? Frankly, we need to get closure on three critical policy questions. Frankly, we've sidestepped these questions, I think, for 30 years in this nation. First, what should the national intercity rail system be in America? Profitable routes, routes through federally designated corridors, long-distance routes that are important to underserved markets, or some combination. Amtrak can inform this decision and this discussion, but only policymakers can clearly define Amtrak's mission. Second, Should the system cover the costs of public service that doesn't pay for itself through cross-subsidization, as we do today, or through direct support, or by other means? And finally, how much capital will be provided to support this system in the railroad business, which is the most capital-intensive business in the Western world? As I said a moment ago, we will help inform these policy decisions, particularly with respect to capital, but we cannot make them. I respectfully request that the Congress and the administration take responsibility to help us decide and define the mission of intercity passenger rail service in this country, really for the first time in 30 years, and align the capital resources that are necessary to support it. And we will do everything we can at Amtrak to help inform that discussion and that decision. A couple of weeks ago, at a reception honoring the president of the French National Railway on the 20th anniversary of their high-speed rail system, I told him how much I envied his success, especially when Americans virtually every day come up to me and ask, how come we don't have a passenger rail system like this in America? Well, the answer is that we can if we all summon the will to do it. Across America, the people most affected by the tale of two Amtraks, travelers, business leaders, governors, and mayors, want the federal government to make a clear policy and financial commitment to intercity passenger rail service. I know that working together with them and policy leaders in this town and national interests across this country, we can rewrite the book on Amtrak. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And we do have time for some questions. You spent a great deal of time toward the end of your remarks on your mission quandary. Fundamentally incompatible missions, making profit or providing public service, and asked the Congress and the administration to help resolve that quandary. What do you want to do?
What I don't want, I'll tell you what I don't want. What I don't want is a mandate and a responsibility to run a national system and not have the resources aligned. I think this is about forming consensus and making a decision about what America wants its intercity rail passenger system to be. And it's about aligning and making a decision, a conscious decision, about how much we want to pay for that to make a difference in the American economy.
Your newest star, of course, is the Acela, as you mentioned. How's it doing? How are you doing in terms, are you meeting your ridership and revenue targets? How's the reliability of the new train?
We evaluate much of what we do these days, and it's a relatively new phenomenon at Amtrak, but we evaluate much of what we do around a very intensive market research program. And in fact, the original design of the Acela program and all of the details around its service package were put together after years of very careful market research. And what all of our research, both anecdotally and formally, tells us is that it's a very powerful engine. And we only have 4 round trips running today on the corridor between Washington and Boston. By the end of the year, we'll have a full 20 train sets running every day. All Metroliners will be replaced with Acela train sets, and some during the peak hours between New York and Washington. We will also double our frequencies between New York and Boston. And based upon our research and our experience to date, both around performance as well as attractiveness in the marketplace, it'll be a very powerful engine, not only for Amtrak's bottom line, but really make a difference around the issues we talked about here, congestion, frustration, and the like. both on highways and in the skies in the Northeast.
When might we see, I understand that the answer to this depends in part on funding, but when might we see a Acela service on other routes in other parts of the country?
As I always say, every day, it's all about money. It's all about having the national will and making a decision and being clear and firm about what this nation wants to commit to. And we can build a powerful system of high-speed services in many corridors around this land. It is it's a fundamental opportunity to really make a difference. And modeled upon our early Acela experience, we can transport this concept all around this nation. And it's what, frankly, business leaders and local officials are desperate for. I travel around this country a couple of days a week, and there is a chorus building out there around the need for practical choices and practical alternatives. We're not the ultimate fix, but this is about developing a balanced system that works well as a system and most efficiently as a system. And with a relatively modest amount of capital investment, which requires a federal public policy commitment for the first time in 30 years, we can develop and run a system that we can all be very proud of, as the French and the Germans and the Japanese and the Spanish and the Swedes are today.
You expressed a degree of optimism that you are going to be able to make your financial targets, the congressional mandate. On the other hand, Secretary Mineta said earlier this month, Amtrak's books, in his words, don't look good. If you cannot be operationally self-sufficient by 2003, how do you inform this debate that you have said has to take place? And if one of the options is the dissolution of Amtrak, speculate on what a transportation system without Amtrak would look like.
Well, I'm not going to speculate about that because I am, as I said in my remarks, completely confident that we will achieve operational self-sufficiency. But, you know, one of my messages here today is that's as usual, you know, and that's the way, unfortunately, this town works. But unfortunately, it's a short-sighted objective. Now, I will tell you that the concept of operational self-sufficiency has brought extraordinary discipline to this company around the way it manages its business, and I think it's been a very worthwhile objective, and we will achieve that. My real point here today, though, is that it is, in many respects, an artificial political construct. And in the end, due to the way we are required to run a national system, and achieve that operational self-sufficiency requires extraordinary internal cross-subsidies. And the real question is, looking out beyond 2003, what do we want the national passenger rail system to be, and how much do we want to pay? Are we willing to invest to really make that happen?
As Congress debates, even as Congress is on the threshold of that debate, potentially, its political complexion is changing. I know that people in your position have to follow these kinds of things very, very closely. Does the prospect of Senator Hollings becoming chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee change Amtrak's prospects in any degree?
Well, let me answer that in two ways. First of all, Amtrak really has has had extraordinary bipartisan support over the years, and we're thankful for that, number one. Number two, I'm very optimistic about our prospects because of people like Mayor Coles and the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National Governors Association, Chambers of Commerce, and business leaders. There is a groundswell of support for this concept all across this nation. The combination of historical bipartisan support coupled with the power and the energy of America speaking all across this land about this critical question, it's what's going to drive this agenda. I am convinced of that, number one. Number two, with respect to Senator Hollings, he's always been an extraordinary supporter of rail service, passenger rail service, and Amtrak.
Thank you. You have searched for new and enhanced revenue streams in your effort to achieve that, that self-sufficiency, operational self-sufficiency. One of those is for the National Railway Passenger Service, the freight business. Tell us a little bit about your freight plans, why, and is it very profitable?
When we were challenged with the task of operating self-sufficiency, we made a conscious decision that we need to exploit and develop every conceivable method of generating revenue and income to help us continue to support a national system, which by its nature is not profitable in a classic commercial sense. As a consequence of that, we've been very aggressive and focused around finding revenue streams flowing from our assets or from our franchise. And we've got a very powerful franchise under the law that we had an opportunity to develop. And that included by using our existing, in particular, long-distance train network to find niches in the time-sensitive markets out there to earn additional income and revenue. And frankly, it's been a slow process of evolution, in large measure because the success there over the long haul, requires commercial agreements with freight railroads. We've worked very hard on developing and concluding agreements with freight railroads. And mail and express business is a significant niche business that we have engaged in over the past couple of years. And I have committed to the freight railroads that we will only do that in a way which does not compete with their franchise. And I think you'll see over the next couple of years more and more commercial agreements with freight railroads about Amtrak being just another channel to move time-sensitive products, in particular over long-haul distances across the country. It's not an ultimate solution, but it is a niche that we're exploring and developing, and not in a competitive way in any way with the freight railroad industry.
So, California strawberries to Washington, that's an example of what the kind of thing that works for you?
Yeah, actually, the most opportunity, first of all, the mail business has always been a tradition on the railroads. And in fact, you know, if you go back many, many decades, was one of the prime contributors to, quote, profits in the on the passenger network that the private freight railroads owned. And in fact, there's an interesting history. If you go back to and lots of folks, some in this room I think, have studied this, but if you go back to the decline of the major passenger railroad systems in this country, which subsequently became Amtrak, what you find is the trigger for much of those bankruptcies flowed from a loss of mail business or a conscious decision by the Postal Service to remove business, or the inability of the railroads to meet the market requirements effectively.
And yet passengers remain your chief mandate. What in the next 5 years can Amtrak offer a business traveler that the airlines can't or won't?
Our entire focus is around designing a service package that is attractive and comfortable and convenient. And, you know, time matters. And in many corridors around the country, we can, as we invest capital, produce very, very competitive trip times, downtown to downtown. So that's number one, and time is always one of the most important considerations that we have to promote, and where we can really make a difference in terms of attractiveness of this rail system. But that requires capital to invest. But with that capital to invest, we can significantly improve travel times on trains all across this country and really make a difference. Beyond trip time, we have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort around market research to make sure that all aspects of the system which a customer touches at Amtrak is considered a positive experience. And thanks to a lot of work by the troops, by the employees of Amtrak. We have really had, in many ways, a cultural transformation going on in the company about valuing guests. This is a customer service business. The railroad industry, and I think in its early years, Amtrak had a fair amount of difficulty in presenting itself as a warm and attractive and inviting and customer-sensitive business. We are no longer a train business. We're a travel services business, and it means that you have to be warm, you have to be inviting, as you say, you have to smile, but it's a lot more than that. It's about having every piece of the system that you touch, every face you interface with on the system, go out of its way to be friendly, helpful, and responsive. I can't tell you how powerful that kind of behavior is in any customer service business, but in particular at Amtrak, where retained customers is a vital part of our business plan. This is about not only attracting customers, but retaining customers who step on us for the first time. And we put a lot of effort and a lot of energy into making sure that everybody in the company, from the top to the bottom, thoroughly understands that this is not a train business. This is a customer service and travel business. I think, frankly, that's one of the features and aspects of the newly developing Amtrak that positions us very effectively in the context of lots of frustration and lots of customer service degradation that's going on right now because of the capacity constraints on the other modes out there.
You have lamented that intercity passenger rail gets less than 1% of the federal transportation spending, and yet this questioner asks, is that not in line with or proportional to intercity rail's share of travel mileage covered by Americans?
Yeah, let me deal with that one directly, because that one tends to get my hair up on the back of my neck. You know, Amtrak often gets compared to the aviation industry. First of all, it's not fair, and I don't want to appear to be whining here, but it's not fair to stack up Amtrak as one carrier against the 21 top carriers that constitute the domestic air business in this country. And if you rank us amongst the top 21 carriers in this country, we rank 9th in terms of demand, right behind TWA and just ahead of America West. And as the high-speed program takes off over the next couple of years, we will begin to inch up toward carrying the same level of demand as continental airlines, number one. Number two, that puts us at about 4% of all air rail travel that goes on in this country. And I think the maximum market share that any one carrier, the biggest of the air carriers, has is in the 11 or 12% range. I would suggest that that's respectable, number one. Number two, this is a matter of, market share and attractiveness flows from the level of capital investment we want to spend on this system to build frequency and build reliability and build travel time. And, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to maintain a market share, which is about 1.5% to 2% of travel demand in this country nationally, when you're not empowered to be able to invest to elevate that market share, when all of the competing modes have had their infrastructure basically built for them as a matter of transportation policy. Now, if you look at the Northeast Corridor, it is extraordinarily powerful around market share, and it has to do with the attractiveness of the Northeast Corridor as a featured and positive experience, particularly with respect to frequency and travel time. We have, between Washington and New York today, when you add up all the markets and all of the cities, in terms of air rail share, about 70% of that market. And on the north end, where we have not had frequencies historically, and where we have not had travel time advantages between New York and Boston, historically that share has been in the 12% range. And we fully expect when Acela is launched that that share will grow to at least 50% and probably higher than that. So, it's all a matter of what are we willing to invest to make the rail system attractive, to grow market share, which in the end will improve our bottom line and make a big difference in economies all across this nation.
As you talk about capital investment, one of the things that drives that, of course, is the need to maintain and upgrade the track system. And yet you resist the option of putting responsibility for doing that in the hands of another body while you focus on trains. Explain your position on that, please.
You know, I've spent the last hour or so discussing a set of issues which I think are absolutely vital public policy issues around mission and public policy and investment and capital, both capital needs as well as opportunities that would flow from investing capital. And frankly, I've said this before the House Appropriations Committee a couple of weeks ago when I was asked a similar question. I think the concept, I think the Amtrak Reform Council and the initial report that they produced, I respect what they're trying to do. But, you know, I'll be perfectly frank, I think that it's premature. I think that there are much more fundamental policy issues that we have to deal with, that I have spoken about here today, that we need to decide before we start revisiting structure, number one. Number two, I will tell you that specifically when I put on my railroad operations hat, the Northeast Corridor is the crown jewel, I believe, of a crown jewel in America's transportation system. It is an extraordinary high-density operation. We're running about 1,700 trains a day in trust for a lot of other interests, including commuter organizations. My good friends from New Jersey, Mike Chevelle, I don't know where you are, Mike, is the vice chairman of New Jersey Transit's board, is here, and all the old boys from New Jersey Transit. We run those trains. They run their trains on the Northeast Corridor, as does SEPTA and the MBTA in Boston. And it's an incredibly powerful asset. And, you know, you just have to look to the experience that's been going on in Great Britain over the past couple of years around the concept of separating infrastructure from operations. And you have to take a step back and say, you know, we better get rational about this because there's a lot at stake. As a railroad guy, I will tell you that the separation of infrastructure from operations and planning and maintenance in a high-density, high-speed operation using mixed traffic, freight trains running at 25 or 30 miles an hour and high-speed trains running at 150 miles an hour, and more capacity requirements being built to feed more and more trains through that network. As soon as you begin to balkanize responsibility and accountability for what in the end is a critical operating function that is underpinned every day, every single day, by safety considerations. The number one consideration we wake up about and discuss and focus on every day. I think you're playing with fire.
The success you and those who've worked for you have built in the Northeast Corridor, which you want to replicate in other potentially high-traffic areas, how do you set that against the concept of a national network of intercity rail traffic? For example, this questioner says the Vermonter northbound only connects with one train from Florida southbound and has one to Chicago and one to Florida. How do you improve that when you're focusing on the profitability of high-traffic routes?
It's the mission. We need clarity about the mission. What does America want us to be? What does the United States Congress want it to be? It's the underlying theme here that I've been discussing, and it's a theme that we have all sidestepped for 30 years in this town and in this nation. And, you know, with the right level of public investment, we can do anything. we can be extraordinarily powerful and we can make a difference. You know, today we run basically a skeleton of a system that was in place in this nation, you know, 40 or 50 years ago. And we need public policy consensus, and we need decisions more than anything else about what America wants us to be and what America is prepared to pay for.
Well, perhaps that's part of the answer to the question I'm about to ask you as well. You were talking a few moments ago about your friends and former colleagues from the New Jersey rail system, but why does Amtrak charge $25 for Metro Park to New York Penn Station, and New Jersey Transit only $2.65 for senior ticket?
It has a little bit, you know, let me tell you, that says it all. You know, New Jersey Transit, I used to run New Jersey Transit. New Jersey Transit is clearly, without doubt, a public service enterprise in the state of New Jersey, and there's no question about it. It's a public service responsibility. And the fare structures are established that way, and there's a clear recognition and understanding that that's an obligation of the state of New Jersey to subsidize the costs of those train operations, not pass along all of those costs to the customers in order to facilitate the attractiveness of the transit system in New Jersey. Life isn't that easy for me or us. You know, we have a conflicting mission, and you know, our fare structure is in many respects, in particular on the Northeast Corridor, market-based, and you charge what the market can bear. And fortunately, our fare structure and our frequencies and our on-time performance are enabling us to generate extraordinary growth on the Northeast Corridor over the past couple of years, and with Acela, that'll just continue.
What, in your view, are the most underserved populations in terms of the vast population out there who could be riding Amtrak but aren't?
You know, that gets to my point also about mission. You know, what we need is a consensus and a decision by public policymakers in America about what are underserved markets. What are the markets and what are the communities which, as a matter of public service, require intercity rail service as a matter of local economy or as a matter of connectivity. That's the fundamental public policy question I think we need to confront in this nation. On the other hand, I know there are clearly corridors across this land that will be powerful, very powerful. You know, the Northeast Corridor extended south to Richmond and Raleigh and Charlotte and Atlanta, and ultimately to Jacksonville and West Palm and Miami. What we need is an Atlantic coast corridor. You know, I met with the Sam Williams, the president of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, and who has coalesced all chambers of commerce in major metropolitan areas in the entire Southeast around this question. And clearly, that's where the population is going. That's where the demand is. And we, I think, have a responsibility to figure out a way to shape public policy that enables us to anticipate that growth, not get behind the curve. Let's get out ahead of the curve for once and really make a difference. And there are corridors like that all across this land.
We have time for about one more question, but first, on behalf of the National Press Club, Mr. Warrington, I'd like to thank you for coming today, and I'd like to present you with this certificate of appreciation from the National Press Club, with our thanks, and with this coveted National Press Club mug, which will look very handsome on your desk.
This is great because I don't have any mugs.
We'll trade you for an Amtrak mug. And gee, I'm almost embarrassed to ask this, but almost.
You want to know how old I really am?
Does the Amtrak president have a private rail car?
No, I don't. We do actually, we do have a car called the Beech Grove, which is an old Metroliner car that the guys in our Beech Grove shop turned into an inspection car, and we use that primarily for inspections. But no, fortunately or unfortunately, the Amtrak president doesn't have a private car.
Thank you very much, George Warrington. And I would like to thank all of you for coming today. I would also like to thank National Press Club staff members Melinda Cook, Pat Nelson, Joanne Booz, Melanie Abdel-Dermot, and Howard Rothman for organizing today's lunch. Also, thanks to the NPC Library for their research. Thank you. Good day. Of commuter rails in New Jersey and Delaware before joining Amtrak in 1994. His first Amtrak job was running the Northeast Corridor operations, where he turned the Metroliner from a money loser into a system that not only covers its own costs, but also throws off profits to cover part of Amtrak's overhead. When Amtrak's board dismissed its last president, Warrington got to test drive the office for a year, and 17 months ago, the board removed the acting prefix from his job title, but by then he already had a full head of steam. Amtrak was committed to spending $800 million or so for Acela Express, a new high-speed, upscale train, 21 trains, in fact, to revolutionize service in the Northeast Corridor. Well, Acela was a year and a half late leaving the station, piling up more losses for Amtrak and giving more fuel to its critics, but it is rolling now and attracting record ridership revenues and customer service accolades on its maiden Washington, New York, Boston routes. Mr. Warrington says Acela eventually will generate $200 million a year in net profit. Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is John Aubuchon, and I'm senior correspondent for Newsnight Maryland with Maryland Public Television and vice president of the National Press Club. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. The video archive of today's luncheon is provided by Connect Live and is available through the National Press Club website at press.org. National Press Club luncheons also are carried live by many sites on the World Wide Web. Press Club members may also access transcripts of our luncheons at our website. Non-members may purchase transcripts, audio, and videotapes by calling 1-888-343-1940. Before introducing our head table, I'd like to remind our members of future speakers. On Monday, June 4th, Gerald R. Ford, former President of the United States, short rope, struggling to build a solid financial footing under Amtrak by 2003, the year Congress has set for pulling away the chair of federal operating subsidies. The official Warrington Amtrak view, it'll be tight, but they'll make it, provided Congress takes a very different view on another pot of money. Mr. Warrington wants $30 billion over the next 2 decades for capital costs for new and modern rolling stock, infrastructure, and other improvements. Considering what we spend on highways and airports, he has said, that's not too much. And Amtrak has significant infrastructure problems. Remember the film The Money Pit? Well, substitute Amtrak's track system for that house remodeling hell, and you get the picture. A federal reform council studying Amtrak's future suggests as one option putting those tracks in the hands of another newly created government corporation and letting Amtrak just run the trains, an option Mr. Warrington opposes. George Warrington has been a railroad man for more than a quarter century. Coming up through the ranks at States, we'll present the Gerald R. Ford Prizes for Distinguished Journalism at our next NPC luncheon. Tuesday, June 5th, 2001, Ralph Nader, consumer advocate, will discuss, as he puts it, conceit and consent, the two-party duopoly. And on Friday, June 8th, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, Archbishop of Washington, will be our guest at the Press Club. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards provided at your table and pass them up to me. I'll ask as many as time permits. I'd like now to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly as their names are called. Please hold your applause until all head table guests are introduced. From your right, my left, Frank Wilner of Traffic World, John Horsley, Executive Director of the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, a guest of our speaker, Larry Arnold of the Associated Press, Brent Coles, the Mayor of Boise, Idaho, who is President of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, also a guest of our speaker, Keppler Speakers, who is with the Yomiuri Shimbun, and passing to my direct right is Gil Klein of Media General, who is a past president of the National Press Club. Passing over our speaker for a moment, Gene Grabowski, who is Communications Vice President of the Grocery Manufacturers of America and the Press Club member who arranged today's luncheon. Thank you, Gene. April Taylor of the Detroit News. Sylvia de Leon, member of the Amtrak Board of Directors, again a guest of our speaker. Tim Dobbin of Reuters. Thomas Donlan of Barron's, and Matt Small of Fox News. Thank you. George Warrington is having a good year so far. But in Amtrak's 30th anniversary year, he is also dangling from a very